Okay, so here's the thing. I'm like kind of a huge Star Wars fan. I'm also a big storytelling nerd and thematic freak. See, for me, I find enjoyment in analyzing things, pointing out themes and political messaging, breaking down story tropes, noticing arcs, and deciphering symbols. Um, Needless to say, though, people are confused when I say that I genuinely love and adore every single Star Wars movie in its own way. Okay, except for Solo and The Rise of Skywalker, because they just make me want to scream for multiple different reasons. But that is not what we're talking about today. You see, there's this notion out there that Star Wars is conservative or even fascistic, and for me, being a left leaning person and an anti fascist, this was concerning to me. Like, was one of my favorite franchises of all time secretly fascistic? And, well, no, not at all. In fact, it's probably more anti fascist than it is fascist.
But Emily, what about the Nazi symbolism?
Ugh. Okay, so that's what I really want to talk about today. You see, some low level academics and critics think that just because a film uses certain types of imagery automatically means that they're endorsing said ideology. But that isn't the case for like a lot of media, and so today I'm going to be explaining why Star Wars is not fascistic or even really conservative. So let's get into that. Bum ba-da-dum ba-da-dum bum 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 ba ba-na-na-na na-na-na na-na-na. So what is imagery even? Well, imagery can mean a lot of different things, but in the context of what we were discussing today, imagery is going to mean the use of rhetoric images, figurative description, or illusion, rhetorical images to the collective. In layman's term, it basically means that something, whether directly in the text or in societal context, means something to the masses of people. We use imagery all the time in media, especially in film, which is an inherently visual media and it's super easy to pull off. Another way of putting this is like symbolism. Now, they're not exactly the same thing. Symbolism in storytelling usually refers to a specific object within the text having some sort of symbolic meaning that relates to something within the text, like some sort of theme. For instance, in Star Wars, the image of the Death Star is like a symbol of ultimate destruction and overwhelming power of the Empire within the Star Wars universe. But the symbolic meaning of the Death Star in our universe is also ultimate destruction and death and of the Empire and all that. But also, it could be read as an allegory or a symbolic stand in for the nuclear bomb, a planet killing, destroying weapon. In fact, in Rogue One, they correctly use atomic bomb imagery when the Death Star strikes. The bright lights, the ultimate destruction, the vaporizing of characters, the massive shockwave. It clearly is a representative stand in or is using imagery of the atomic bomb. And so, for those out there who are confused by the idea that there's any symbolic imagery in Star Wars, to begin with, let me just run a few examples of fascistic imagery in Star Wars. The Imperial uniforms. The fact that they tried to create a Death Star laser that can destroy entire planets, which can be read as the nuclear bomb, which the Nazis were trying to create. The fact that they basically worship their leader in an almost godlike way. The fact that Darth Vader literally means Dark Father in a what language? That's right, German. The fact that they called their soldiers stormtroopers, which were what literal Nazi soldiers were called, and that's just in the original trilogy. In the prequel trilogy, we see them using scapegoating tactics for different types of people. In the case of the prequels, that this is mostly the Jedi and the Separatists. The fact that the Empire rose peacefully, just like the Nazis, how the Nazis and Hitler came to power.
For a safe and secure society.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
In the sequel trilogy, there's also the fact that the First Order is obsessed with the past. Also, though, like, Kylo actually might be more like a neo-Nazi than like an actual Nazi, but like, you know, a Nazi is a Nazi, okay? So, oh, and in Rebels, we see the Empire enslave several different types of creatures. Noticeably, they enslaved the Wookiees, and they also had massive genocidal campaigns against the Lothalians and the Geonosians. And that's all the stuff I just thought off the top of my head.
Okay, so like, there's fascist imagery in Star Wars, so that must mean it's promoting fascism.
No. See, noticing imagery is just the first step. The next step is looking at framing. Okay, so this should be the big obvious factor whenever anyone is considering whether imagery is meant to be endorsing a certain ideology or not, and that is framing. For instance, all the stuff that I mentioned above is associated with the bad guys of the film, the unquestionable evil bad guys of the film. These films aren't using Nazi and fascist imagery in order to try to secretly endorse people into the far right. Rather, it's using this imagery and assumes that the mainstream audience associates the Nazis and fascism in general as evil. But intentions at the end of the day don't really matter. Things aren't framed correctly. It doesn't matter how pure your intentions are. If you botch up the end product, none of that actually matters. So, how can you use imagery and illusions in your stories without endorsing that type of ideologies behind it? Well, there's two main ways you can do this. The first way is framing it in a intimidating or threatening way. In a way, it takes the message behind the imagery very seriously and tries to denounce it by showing its harmful aspects. It shows the horrors that threaten the main character and the world in hopes that the audience will see the things they're symbolizing in a scary or threatening light. The problem, though, that can arise by this is that I kind of like accidentally making the bad guys or the imagery cool or edgy, and accidentally making the audience believe that the ideology or these symbols should be taken seriously and thought over with serious intent. Now, this isn't inherently a bad thing, but it can accidentally lead people to sympathizing with the Nazis, and that's a problem. The other way to denounce a certain ideology through framing is to take the comedic route. Now, this is the way more controversial way of denouncing an ideology, but the idea behind it is to show the ridiculous aspects of an ideology and sort of denounce the idea that it's cool, and rather it's just kind of ridiculous. Now, the problem with that is that it also tends to humanize the characters or concepts that you're making fun of, and people argue it makes people not take these certain positions or ideologies seriously, and that could lead to people to thinking that is harmless. However, if used correctly, I think the comedic group can actually be even more effective than the fear tactic, because unlike the fear tactic, the comedic route doesn't require you to really think about the subject you're making fun of, but rather reveal the fact that these positions are inherently ridiculous. Now, of course, this is a lot harder to pull off, and if handled incorrectly, it could again lead to the humanization of these ideologies or characters, and also can cause a lot of cringe and a ton of backlash. So now you don't have to just choose one of these tactics. In fact, in my opinion, it's kind of best when it's used together. And oh, wait, that's exactly what Star Wars does. For instance, the stormtroopers, which, again, were what the literal Nazis were called, uh, are constantly being ridiculed in the Star Wars franchise, but are also seen as grave threats in the Star Wars franchise. Another example of this can be seen by the Drone Army in the prequel trilogy, which essentially is supposed to kind of re-represent like the stormtroopers in the original trilogy, though I will say there is more intentional comedic elements that were a lot more, as I said, intentional and also frequent. Another example of this is General Hux in the sequel trilogy. That is until the last movie, when they decided to make him a good guy.
I don't care if you win. I need Kylo Ren to lose.
I might make an entire video about that, but in episode 8, at least, this was handled well, showing his ridiculousness, but also the darker and more horrific sides of him. In fact, this worked so well in episode 8 that it actively made people like hate Hux. Like, after The Force Awakens, there were definitely some people out there who thought he was like tough, who liked his like cool, tough, fascist demeanor, and was like, and then like episode 8 came out and everyone was just like,
ew, he's like soft and weak and stupid and actually kind of ridiculous.
well, actually, since this was episode 8, they were more like,
Ryan Johnson completely ruined Star Wars. They made the new target. You missed Solo on a weekly. Ryan Johnson ruined Star Wars.
obviously it wasn't exactly like that, but you understand the point.
Yeah, but Emily, you said that Star Wars was anti-fascist. Just because you prove that a film is fascist doesn't mean it's not anti-fascist.
Yes, so let's actually get into that. So if you're using imagery and parallels that you're trying to denounce, the best way to do this is by coming up with a counterpoint. Now, this isn't a necessary step, but it's a good way to fully denounce an ideology, to make it obvious to everyone that you're denouncing X ideology or institution by saying that this Y is the good thing, ideology or person, if you catch my drift. And Star Wars, at least in the original trilogy, there is a very clear good versus evil narrative set up by Luke and Vader, the Empire and the Rebellion, Luke versus Palpatine, the Stormtroopers versus the Ewoks, the light side versus the dark side. I mean, literally, yeah, you get the picture. So if the Empire equals Nazis and fascism, then what do the Rebellion represent?
Dude, that's a good question.
In the original trilogy, it's sort of purposely left up for interpretations, but it does make one thing clear. They are anti-empire. They are fully against the empire, aka fascism. So they're coded as anti-fascist. They actually kind of remind me of the Free France movement, which was an insular group within Nazi occupied territory. Anyways, but in this group, they were actually ideology diverse, ranging from like communists to like conservative liberals. And when I mean liberal, I mean that in the actual sense of the word, not the American sense of the word. And when you look at extended canon, and when I mean extended canon, I'm talking about like the non-saga related movies and television shows, like Rebels, and in even Rogue One, we see that ideology within the rebellion is quite factionalized, and there are very heated arguments and debates, not only about tactical level, but from like a fundamental level on what they are or what they should represent. But they all end up coming together to defeat their one common enemy, that being the Empire. In the original trilogy specifically, the rebellion is at a stage where its members are so united, at least from what we can see, that it doesn't matter if they have political disagreements with their comrades. They clearly care and respect each other, and their lives matter to them. And that's actually one of the key differences between the Empire and the Rebellion. The Empire wastes human, or I guess life forms, lives willingly, while the Rebellion actively tries to save them, even if they do a pretty bad job at it. For instance, in episode 5, the main priority when their base was attacked in the opening scene isn't to save the base, but rather to evacuate its members and make sure everyone escapes safely. While in episode 4, when the rebels are attacking the Death Star, there was no evacuation or attempt to escape. Sure, this could be brought up as hubris, but I mean, they were also willing to blow up an entire planet of people who quote unquote rebel against them. Like, this is never explicitly stated in the movie or any canon sources from what I know, from what I have seen, but we know that the Empire had many stations all over the galaxy, so there was probably at least some presence on Alderaan, so they just killed a bunch of their own people when surely they could have warned them to evacuate. Also, as we see in Rogue One, they were more than willing to destroy their own military base with hundreds of their soldiers and resources because they think that it might cripple the rebellion, which, as we know, fails miserably. Second of all, these films never try for a second to justify the Empire or its ideology. It's, again, a pretty straightforward good versus evil narrative, so there's really no...
But Emily, what about the Vader redemption arc?
What about it?
Don't you think by giving it genocidal, fascist, a redemption arc makes the movie retroactively justify the Empire and by proxy fascism?
No? Vader's redemption arc is by no way justifying the Empire in any way. But to really make sense of this, we need to take a look at Anakin's entire arc as a whole, meaning we're gonna have to talk about the prequels. Bum 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 ba-dum bum ba-da dun 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 bum ba-dum bum. So there's a reason why I haven't talked about the prequels much in this video, and it's not because they're bad or they go against my main points or anything. It's just that the prequels don't really use a lot of fascist symbolism in general. Don't get me wrong, they allude to the Empire a lot, which, I mean, is an allegory for the Nazis or, you know, just fascism in general. But the prequels are, quite frankly, a lot more complicated and, dare I say it, deeper than the original trilogy. I'm probably going to make an entire video about the prequels and the hidden meanings and the symbolism behind it. But for right now, let's focus on the two main villains of the first two trilogy, Vader, aka Anakin, and Palpatine, aka Darth Sidious, aka the Empire.
But Emily, Anakin is the hero of the prequel trilogy.
No, Anakin is the protagonist of the prequel, not the hero. There is a difference. A protagonist is a character your story centers around. It's the main character. The hero of the story is the good guy, or the main good guy. Now, this doesn't mean that the hero can't be complex or morally gray at some times, but at the end of the day, the narrative has to frame the character's true self, or their actions, as morally or mostly morally right thing to do for a given situation. Anakin is not framed like this. Sure, the films do give him reasons for turning to the dark side, some of which the films themselves point out as absurd and irrational, and others are more complex, which again is another topic for another video. But first of all, just because you give a villain motivations doesn't mean that the story is endorsing the villain's perspective. Again, you have to look at the framing. And two, the films never really make a case for the dark side or the Empire. More just like why Anakin would leave the Jedi. Furthermore, when he turns to the dark side, the film wastes no time demoralizing Anakin. Literally, his first act as a Sith is him slaughtering children, young children. Like, in the eyes of what I hope is everyone, he is, like, Anakin is like dead, and Vader has completely replaced him, and he is no longer a sympathetic character in any way. I mean, he murdered children. In fact, his demoralization worked so well in episode 3 that a lot of people don't even think he should have been redeemed in episode 6. Now, I don't necessarily believe that, but let's talk about his redemption. So, Vader redeeming himself comes in two parts. One is killing Palpatine, who represents unquestionable, unredeemable evil, in which all the Star Wars films make absolutely no effort in trying to say anything else. And no, you're not going to be talking about the heresy noted Rise of Skywalker. And two is basically letting himself die. This is that he's not worthy of being left alive. His whole redemption is basically him destroying the dark side along with the Empire, and that includes himself. That's why Vader can't live at the end of the film, though Anakin does live on as like a Force ghost. So I mean, still, Vader's redemption arc doesn't justify fascism at all. The only thing it says is that terrible people can redeem themselves, or at least see the error of their ways and try to fix their mistakes. And even the film says he still needs to die. So clearly, Star Wars is not fascist, even though it does use fascist imagery. The films don't sell fascism or the Empire, whatever, as anything but terrible. And I would argue, for the most part, it worked. I mean, it's not like Star Wars fans are notoriously known for consuming products with fascist imagery in it or something. Oh, yeah. That's right. Dun 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 dun. When I started this whole thing, I wanted to try to figure out why there were so many, though by no means the majority, alt-right or fascist people within the Star Wars fandom, and why so many people were reading these films as conservative or even fascistic. Especially since, for me, these films bring out, my inner rebel. These films make me feel like I could take on the Empire. which is why I always found it strange that a lot of, not only Star Wars fans, but people in general tended to wear or promote merch that features the Empire in general. And that just never really made sense to me. Why is there so much merchandising relating to the Empire and the First Order? Well, okay, so here's the thing. This is where things get a little bit more complicated and, to be honest, moves into more the realm of speculation. There is absolutely no way to prove any malice intent of the CEO or the marketing executives responsible for perpetuating the reproduction and normalization of the empire, which is in turn propping up fascist imagery. So I'm not going to be claiming that. Let's just assume that these people were completely stupid and ignorant of any context that the imagery might suggest, and how propping it up could lead to the normalization of this problematic imagery in the future. But at the end of the day, intent doesn't really matter because the end result is still the same. Now, there is actually a good reason from a marketing perspective why they would use the imagery of the Empire specifically. Their reason why the ships like the Death Star, or TIE fighters, or Star Destroyers are used so much because by design, they were made to be striking and intimidating, which in the films is framed as terrifying and dangerous. But take it out of the context and frame it differently, it becomes a technical marvel or powerful, awe-inspiring weapon. This also feeds into the American fetishization of weapons and war in general, but that's a topic for another video entirely. Vader is used a lot because he's probably the most developed and most beloved character in the entire series, and his design is simple and iconic enough that it's easy to put his imagery everywhere, which is why Vader's imagery is used more than Anakin's. Well, that and because a lot of people hate the prequels. And there's the Stormtroopers, which is probably the most interesting out of all three of these examples. Okay, so first we need to talk about the Stormtrooper design, which is quite simple, eye-catching, and most importantly, at least from a marketing perspective, projectable. So right away, this was a merchandising cash cow. Now, in the movies, this design serves both practical and narrative purposes. From a practical standpoint, the design is simple and it makes the costumes/helmets easy to reproduce, which is good because a lot of extras would be wearing it and you don't want to spend too much time and money on extra costume. Notice how in the Star Wars films there is almost never a stormtrooper alone. They are always at least usually with one other stormtrooper, which makes them feel more like a unified hive mind, which in our individualistic culture is the most terrifying thing imaginable and is also associated with fascism and communism, but that's a topic for another video. The helmet also covers up the face, which in turn is meant to cover up its humanity. That's why when they take off their helmets, it is a powerful, humanizing moment, usually symbolizing the people turning to the good side. Think of Vader in the last moments of his life, or Finn or FN 9187 at the beginning of Force Awakens. So with the proper framing, as we discussed earlier, the stormtroopers become a large, menacing, also incompetent force. But take the framing out, and what do you have? An empty vessel in which people can easily project themselves into. the perfect merchandising vehicle. But there is one problem with using stormtroopers specifically in marketing/merchandising. And that's that they're more strongly associated and connected with the Nazis, way more than like the ships or Vader, and even to an extent Palpatine. So, how do marketers separate the context from which they were created into an empty vessel of opportunity that they could be? Well, they changed the narrative. And to explain how to do that, let's take one random piece of merchandising and break it down.
Okay, so first of all, we have the first tactic being used, and that's repetition or oversaturation. Now, obviously, this is on a very, very small scale, but the repeated image of the stormtrooper normalizes and even trivializes its inclusion. Of course, this can't really work on a small scale, but on a large scale where you see hundreds of different types of stormtrooper merch and a bunch of your friends buying it or wearing it, then the overall image becomes more normalized and, more importantly, acceptable in the public consciousness. However, this tactic does have its limits. After all, if you're making things using the stormtrooper image but no one wants to buy it, it doesn't matter how much you produce, people aren't going to buy it. So most of the time, the designers or marketer will include other images in the products that the people are more likely to buy. And this is the second tactic of normalization, which is association. In this t-shirt, we see the popular image of Vader. So, maybe you wouldn't buy this t-shirt if there were just stormtroopers on it, but it has Vader on it, and you would like a t-shirt that has Vader on it. In fact, when I see this tactic being used in Star Wars merch, it's usually Vader, but sometimes it's even just simply the iconic Star Wars logo.
Or, as in my mug, even just using the simple Star Wars logo, completely changes it. Sure, maybe you don't like something because of the stormtrooper imagery on it, but you do like it or will consume it if it has imagery that you do like. As in, for instance, in my mug, the Star Wars logo, or in the case of this shirt, Darth Vader. Hey, even if you don't specifically enjoy it for that symbolism, you're still consuming it, and at the end of the day, that's all businesses care about. However, if the end goal is to make the image itself normalized and desirable, there is one more tactic that is commonly employed to sell stormtrooper image, and that's the humanization of stormtrooper imagery.
Now, this can be used in several ways. One is you can show the stormtroopers living normal everyday lives or putting them in comedic situations, contextless, or like in this shirt, imprinting another image on it. In this case, it refers to a Beatles cover that people have positive, or usually have positive connotations associated with. In fact, the entire shtick of this shirt is, hey, it's that Beatles thing, except Star Wars.
And that's kind of where the problem lies. Not necessarily with this shirt specifically, it's just one shirt, but using the empire in merchandising to begin with. It takes fascist imagery and directly associates it with the Star Wars franchise. In fact, one could argue that the imagery of the Empire, Stormtroopers, and Vader are Star Wars. They are symbols of Star Wars just as much as the literal Star Wars logo. So, yeah, I can see how a casual observer can look at the Star Wars franchise as a whole and, with limited knowledge of the source material, can look at the normalization of certain types of fascist imagery being pumped into the public consciousness and think of Star Wars as fascist. But that's ignoring the most important part of Star Wars, the movies. It ignores the anti-fascist imagery of the rebels or the resistance depending on the trilogy, or the Jedi and everything they represent. Perfect? Are the movies thematically perfect? No, especially The Rise of Skywalker. But the fact that this merchandising can define what Star Wars is more than the movies, in my opinion, is kind of disturbing. From someone who loves all of the movies and TV shows except for The Rise of Skywalker and Solos, and I haven't seen Resistance yet, but I'm working on it. I'm working on it. It drives me crazy because Star Wars is, at its core, an anti-fascist story about a small group of rebels taking on the big evil fascist empire. I feel like I should clear some things up just to make sure you don't get the wrong idea. I'm like, no one's probably gonna watch this video, but hey, if you're here, thanks. I really appreciate it, actually. If you look at my view counts on all my other videos, I get like no views, so that's fine. Anyways, I didn't make this video in order to say that if you bought or enjoy Star Wars merch that uses the imagery of the empire, that you're secretly a fascist or a fascist sympathizer, because I would be a major hypocrite if I said that. Though, interestingly enough, none of this, I didn't actually buy any of this. They were all gifts from lovely people who I care about dearly and don't know a lot about Star Wars for the most part. They just saw that it was Star Wars and they thought I'd like it, and I did. I literally geeked out when I got all this stuff, as most of them know. But anyways, I wanted to make this video not only to shed some light on this topic, but because I've also seen a lot of Star Wars fans, I'm gonna put that in quotation marks, because use like fascistic and authoritarian rhetoric, and even worse, I've seen like actual like neo-Nazi, like fascists, or right-wingers or alt-right-wingers or whatever they want to call themselves, using Star Wars as like a gate into fascism, and manipulating like the text and the fandom in order to suit their agenda, and because let's get something clear here, like, you are not a real Star Wars fan if you're a fascist. And I'm not saying that because I'm personally an anti-fascist. I'm saying that because these Star Wars texts are so inherently like anti-fascist. Like, if they are one thing, they're anti-fascist, that I don't understand like how any like actual fascist could enjoy these. Now, I'm not saying that like if you don't like these films that you are a fascist or fascist sympathizer or anything like that, because there's multiple reasons why you don't like a film or franchise or the Star Wars fandom or whatever. There's plenty of reasons why, but personally, I still love Star Wars, and after I revisited some of the movies and thought about them from a more intellectual level, I was reminded why I love these movies so much, and I hope you can find that appreciation too, or newfound appreciation, I don't know. And if not, hopefully you learned something about imagery and symbolism and the cruel world of marketing. So if you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up. It would really make me feel better about myself. Also, while I was making this video, I thought of like 1,000 other videos to make about Star Wars, some less politically charged, some just as much. or maybe even a little bit more. So if you're interested in any of that, subscribe to my channel and ring that bell so you don't miss another upload. You can follow me and my lovely writing partner, who is also a huge Star Wars fan, by the way, on Instagram and Tumblr, and you can check out our website and blog, which is linked in the description below, and hopefully I will see you all later. Bye!